Record this chat just in case anything interesting comes up in the questions, really, not because I haven't said this before. Think of some interesting questions, because I think there are a lot of questions around the practice, and I don't think that maybe there's often enough free enough discussion, because certainly in the days that I was in Mysore, it was made clear that it was one way, and well, it had always been that way. But I mean, I think my interest in doing, have you seen the podcast and other things, was originally this idea that the ashtanga practice as we know it has always been a tradition in evolution. It's always been something that's been evolving, just like yoga's been evolving, right? So that doesn't make it wrong or less valid. It just means that maybe we approach it more practically, and I know that there are different ways to approach things, and that's okay. And tradition is more about conveying general principles rather than specifics. And I think perhaps what I noticed in more recent years, sometimes the emphasis is very much on specifics, like which hand to grab, or we call pedantics even, which little things, right, rather than the big general principles of, what is the basic technique in the shape, rather than what your little toe's doing, or this or that, And so, yes, when I started interviewing, and Teresa and I, if you don't know, we ran Purple Valley. In fact, Teresa ran Purple Valley and started it as an Ashtanga retreat centre. Before that, Purple Valley in Goa was just a general yoga centre, and she liked Ashtanga, so she just wanted to make it an Ashtanga retreat centre, so that's how it became the Ashtanga retreat centre. And I was a yoga teacher in London, but I was also a cook. I had supported myself through cooking for many years, yes, it was a difficult market in London, because at the time, it was mainly a vegetarian. I was always vegetarian, and there were very little vegetarian restaurants really at the time, and so I was a bit stuck in terms of how many places I could go. So I started cooking in different retreat centres, because that was an obvious way to learn the practice and to travel around. So that's how I ended up meeting Teresa. I came to Purple Valley. She employed me as a cook, and that was in 2007, I think, and we've been together ever since. So funny little circumstance, I haven't only cooked for Teresa ever since. I then started off going to Mysore more. In fact, I was on my way to Mysore in the first place, but to be honest, I'd travelled a lot in my life, but I was kind of intimidated of India, and everyone always says, oh, India, it's kind of, it's crazy, and you need to be prepared to go. And so I thought, all right, well, maybe I should just go to Goa first of all in a retreat centre, and find my way with it and see how, see how India is before I go to Mysore, and in this situation there. So I never ended up going to Mysore that year, because I met Teresa, and then the following year we came back, and I started going to Mysore. And when you go there, it's easy to get very caught up in, I think, in the scene and in the politics and but I also kind of felt through hosting different teachers at Purple Valley, the older ones especially, like I told you, my teacher Mark Darby, or we had Chuck Miller and Matthias Ratti, and I met Richard Freeman many times, not in Purple Valley. He never wanted to come to teach in India, actually. But many of the old teachers, and they would say different things about the way they were taught. So I was kind of, if you don't, excuse the pun, keen on trying to promote the different perspectives that were taught in different years in Mysore. My first teacher was John Scott in the UK, and his teacher was Derek Island, who opened a place called the Practice Place in Crete. And Derek Island, for example, was given the splits between Prasarita, the wide leg forward fold, because he was tied in the hamstrings, and Pattabhi Jois encouraged him to put that in, for example. And there were many examples of just different people being given different things. And basically, I suppose the bottom line of this discussion is to say, due to logistics, really. I don't think it's, I think if there were 10 students, I don't think you would have seen Pattabhi Jois teach the same way, nor probably Sharatji teach the same way as taught now. But, the fact is there's so many people there that certain rules have to be kept in place. And we see this kind of progression in the evolution of Ashtanga currently just through numbers, sheer numbers, and the way that has to be when you've got too many people in a room. But, originally, remember, or maybe you don't know, that in Lakshmipuram, when the first students arrived, there was only 8 people to be fitted in that room, 8 people at a time, you know. So I don't know whether anyone's been to the modern new Shala, let's say, in Mysore, and there's over a couple of hundred, I think, that are able to fit in that room. I've not been to that new one. We say the new one. The new one was the Gokulam Shala, which is the main one I practiced in, and Pattabhi Jois was still alive when we first went, and Sharat was teaching kind of, it was a funny year in around 2007, because Pattabhi Jois was obviously in his last years, and he would kind of often fall asleep, and Sharat would jump in and start teaching again. Pattabhi Jois would fall asleep again, suddenly pop up and start counting again, and they would have this funny kind of relationship between, you know, like he would start the class and then fall asleep, and then Sharat would join in, and obviously through deference of his grandfather, as soon as his grandfather woke up, he would go quiet, and then Pattabhi Jois would start counting him.
And the class was 45 minutes.
And Pattabhi Jois used to, at that time, they used to call it the Pattabhi Express, because he used to do the whole class in 45 minutes, the whole primary series. It was very, very fast, and it didn't really. It left you feeling kind of energized, but not in a good way. Like it was a bit too much, really. Yeah, you would feel very energized, but it wasn't very grounding, you know. And so one main difference that, say, more recently that Sharat's done is obviously introduced longer and longer closing series. You know, I think one critique of his early DVD or his early CD, he made a CD before he made a DVD, was a very fast, people said. But then if you look over the years, he's gone longer and longer into longer closing series, you know, which is kind of interesting. But there's not many details that have changed over the last few years in my memory, although, I mean, a number of things stylistically. I remember when we started, we always used to pull the leg up for 5 in Utthita Hasta Padangusthasana. That was always encouraged. The handstands were encouraged a lot more. And, you know, and it's only in the new Shala, really, where there's too many people that the you know, ideas of handstands and things like that weren't encouraged. Or another example, Shirshasana C would be to lift off the head. That's there if you look at Lino Miele's book of Ashtanga Yoga, but it's not there currently in the lead class because, you know, if everyone's trying to lift off their head, you can imagine the kind of domino effects that would occur. So, you know, little things like that. But more interestingly, I think it's the big changes are, and I've got them on the website, you can read the blogs as well. The big changes are really the back bends at the end of primary and not at the end of second series. And really the stylistic way of teaching that originally, I mean, people would be developed through what Pattabhi Jois called the yoga curriculum to have their own sequence. And maybe you didn't know they were to have that. After you did Pattabhi Jois's curriculum, which was primary series and second series, not too dissimilar to what we do, you know, and then advanced A and advanced B. Those two series have been divided into 4 now. But, you know, we don't really need to worry about those too much. They're very advanced, you know. But there were 4 series, and at the time it was expected that, you know, the students would complete that syllabus or that curriculum and then be given their own series, which is called the Rishi series, the seer, the sage, the Rishi, and there would be 15 postures held for longer periods of time. And so my teacher Darby was given the Rishi series, and his wife Joanne was given her own series. It was the different series for different teachers, right? So there was that idea of progression or continuation, you know, in the early days, yeah. It was encouraged for all the students to kind of evolve their own primary second series. Certainly those 2 series, and, you know, some of you might have heard of Nancy Gilgoff. I mean, she was often teaching this, that it was encouraged to be quite sloppy, you know, like not too hard, not too forceful, until Pattabhi Jois, she told me, until you've finished the intermediate series, you shouldn't be forceful with your body. You should hold it a bit weak, a bit loose, because it protects you from injuries, right? So that was the way that she was encouraged. But on the other hand, David Williams was encouraged more stringently and pushed more dynamically, because Pattabhi Jois at that point was teaching 8 people in the room. Often my teacher Darby would be there with his wife on his own, to the 2 of them, you know. So there was a different approach because of numbers, right? They were encouraged to do more, and they were, you know, Nancy used to say she was held in every posture by Pattabhi Jois, and she couldn't do them. She was held there, and then he would encourage her to do the next one, you know. So there was that evolution. It's not to say I always encourage people to do postures which they can't achieve, just more that over a period of time, the person was assumed able to do it, to understand the method of vinyasa, and then encouraged to do, you know, a rough version of their 2 series. series, because certainly the two series really complement each other. The primary series, as you know, is a forward. It's to do with flexion. It's to do with the exhale breath. The second series much to do with the inhale breath and to do with extension. So they kind of complement each other really. It's not a full movement pattern just doing one series probably. And that's not to say I would just whip people through the two series either. It's more like when you understand the position of vinyasa, doesn't mean jump through or jump back. It doesn't mean connective movement. It means incremental, step by step, building, right? So a better way of understanding vinyasa, which is pivotal to the Krishnamacharya method, is entering a posture with awareness and exiting the posture with awareness, right? So it's not like knowing the count. The count, in fact, the count comes later. Right? The count comes when Pattabhi Jois comes over to America for the second time, and he's got a lot of students. And then he starts doing this counted class. Before that, he's not teaching counted class, and he never taught it in Mysore until we reached Gokulam in around 2005, and the bigger studio, and they do a lead class. But vinyasa doesn't mean counted, now you hear John Scott say it's counted method, but if you think about Lino Miele's book, which is funny because John actually was part of that, in Lino Miele's book, which is the first book to record the count, Lino did that because he had been practicing for a couple of years in Mysore, and then he's in Europe, Lino's in Europe, and Pattabhi Jois comes over to France. Lino goes over to do a France workshop because he's very popular in France at the time. Funnily enough, it's those people that hosted Pattabhi Jois have kind of faded away, but Pattabhi Jois used to go to France a lot, and in that retreat, he did a week in France, Lino heard this counting, and he's like, what the hell is this? I've been doing this in Mysore, and no one's talked about counting, and so he started to ask Pattabhi Jois, and first of all, they didn't know what it was. He didn't know what Pattabhi Jois was saying, because he didn't speak good English, and then they started to realise, he's counting something. So then when they realised that, because they didn't even realise that, and then they started to realise, okay, well, then they started to ask him, and then the idea of the count, or recording the count, started to become more and more popular. Yeah? And now, I think, unfortunately, the count is almost taken as vinyasa itself. Whereas, if you look at someone, I think, I like Eddie Stern's work a lot, for example. He's done stuff with Eddie, and I appreciate his take on things. And he suggests in his book one simple thing, that there is entering a posture and exiting a posture with awareness. I like that definition a lot, because really that means stage by stage. Because if you look at students, right, it's not to do with, and I'm judging a student, their level, their understanding of this method, yeah. I'm not looking at their advancedness of what they can do. I'm looking, can they start and stop postures and build sequentially? Or are they all over the place, entering a posture, exiting a posture? But if they start and go in and stop and go, I'll let them go on, because they understand the method. Even if the body can't do it, they're understanding something which is much deeper than what the body can do. Because I think the other fundamental thing to recognize when we're looking at Krishnamacharya and Pattabhi Jois is that Pattabhi Jois, as much as Krishnamacharya, was a massive innovator in as much as he applied sequences to adult bodies, right? Whereas Krishnamacharya was applying these dynamic sequences to the audience that he was given, which was children, right? The Maharaj of Mysore employed Krishnamacharya to teach teenage boys between the age of 12 and 18, yeah? Yep. So we've got to bear that in mind. Doesn't mean Ashtanga's wrong, doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, just means we have to be sensible, because Krishnamacharya, when he went away from teaching that, basically after India got independence, there was a political situations and the Maharaj of Mysore lost a lot of power, and there's other things that I might mention in a minute. Krishnamacharya was out of a job at the Mysore Palace. So he goes away to Chennai and starts teaching in Chennai. You might know his institute in Chennai, run by Desikachar, his son, and then later Kostab. That's another story. But he's not teaching Ashtanga Vinyasa. He's teaching to the older people that he gets then. He's teaching differently. So we can only understand that Krishnamacharya's method is not the sequences. It's not, and Pattabhi Jois comes away with these sequences. My suggestion from the people that I've talked to, and people will contradict and say it's not the case, and what about BNS Iyengar? He's also teaching the sequences, and BNS says he learnt it from Krishnamacharya. But the thing is, Western perspective on things is different to Indian perspective, where things can be the same but different in India, and in England, in the West, we're looking for things to be literally the same, So we have to look in a different lens, I think, when we're looking at Indian tradition, and There's a lot of mythology, which is not to say that mythology is false, it's just that mythology is used to create inspiration and stories because they're powerful, right? Symbol is powerful. If you look at all Indian texts, we're taught with symbol because symbol is emotional. We're not taught with rationalism, right? And the same thing about the Yoga Kurunta and the stories, and Krishnamacharya used those stories, and he didn't want to contradict those stories, yeah? But he also, I mean, if you look at Desikachar's biography of his father, when he asked him about those, I think he says, and he looked up with a wry smile and said, or something like that. He never would say yes or no to the stories of, did he go to the Himalayas? Was the Kurunta really a book of banana leaves where the vinyasa was recorded? It doesn't mean it's not true in the sense of motivating, and it can be true and false at the same time, maybe. Yeah. But the actual sequences, if we want to try and find the truth in a Western way, what is the truth, right? Well, the likelihood is that Pattabhi Jois was the master of ceremonies, and they were asked by the Maharaj of Mysore to regularly, every few weekends, I think, give demonstrations, right? That was part of it. Krishnamacharya was asked to teach politically as well. What he was asked to do is raise them, Maharaj of Mysore was fighting for Indian independence. What he was looking for is to present Indian culture. In many ways he did this, and one of them was through physical arts. Look, we've got an indigenous system, it's creating strong bodies, and it's ours. It's not English, it's ours, and it's creating a strong youth to rise up against the English, overthrow, kick them out. And so one of these, the aspects of this was do demonstrations for the public, raise morale, show them their system, show them what's theirs. And so they would do these regular demonstrations on the request of the Maharaj of Mysore, and Pattabhi Jois was one of the head boys. He would lead people through the sequences. And when you're doing something in a public space, to have all the people doing different things wouldn't be so spectacular as having all the boys do the same thing. So this is my understanding of how the sequences developed, because what we do know when we're talking to someone like Dr. Sharma, who categorically said he was there in the Krishnamacharya days, he was there, he's still alive, this guy, and he says, we all started with Surya Namaskar. You had to start with that. After Surya Namaskar, he says something funnier than me. After Surya Namaskar, you were free. Basically, you were free. You were free. You didn't have to do this. There was no sequences. Yeah. The same with Krishnamacharya's book, his first book, Yoga Makaranda. Although there was other books, it wasn't published till later, and other books he author were published earlier. The first book he wrote was Makaranda, 1938. In those he has his own sequences at the back, like I was telling you, and they're characterized by his building. You build, you build, and it's not to say you're building just this way only. All the sequences, they have different acts, like in a play, different acts, right? You've got an act where your leg behind the head is an act. You've got an act, strength building, you've got a different act. And they're all separate, it's not just like you go like this. It's just, so they build like a vinyasa krama, like building, and then you go, you stop, you've done that bit, and you build another bit, yeah? And it's different acts, So I encourage it not to look so linearly, yeah? Because as you understand, the primary series has certain acts that are tough, but then certain later acts, there's easier again. So it's not like it just goes that way, right? So yeah, Sharma says, well, we were free. Each boy was given a different set of movements depending on their ability and the amount of time that they were studying with Krishnamacharya. And then the sequences were made as a work between Krishnamacharya and Pattabhi Jois. It's likely that Krishnamacharya had a strong hand in this. He's unlikely to have given Pattabhi Jois a free rein to create the sequences, because Krishnamacharya was, as we understand, quite a control freak, and he would not have allowed Pattabhi Jois just to do what he wanted there. So, he definitely would have had the stamp of Krishnamacharya, and they're pretty smart, and they're not perfect, because they were built around a young body and what a young body does. So, we have to be, I think, pragmatic, sensible, yeah, and look at the underlying method of Krishnamacharya, which he explains as posture counter posture. That's one of his fundamental things. It's got a Sanskrit name that always eludes me. It's building, and it builds and it goes like this. Not just building, it's going in ebb and flow. And the third thing, that Krishnamacharya, as I said, it was ironic that Krishnamacharya always stressed over and above anything else is yoga is individually based. Which is funny, because in his name now we've got kind of these very set sequences, whereas Krishnamacharya always based it around the individual bodies, right? And that's the same thing when David Williams comes over to Mysore. He's given the sequence. Even though Pattabhi Jois has gone away with his series, and he's taught from 1948, as the T-shirt says, since 1948, because Krishnamacharya left in 1948. It's likely that Krishnamacharya was kind of a strong character, and the Maharaj of Mysore was still in charge, although he had a different role after Indian independence. And Pattabhi Jois got the role of the head of Sanskrit at the Mysore College. So he was teaching Sanskrit and he was teaching yoga. So it's kind of interesting that Krishnamacharya wasn't given that role, and it was given to Pattabhi Jois instead. So we can only fathom that Krishnamacharya, and people used to say about Krishnamacharya, if they saw him on one side of the street, they would cross to the other side, not to have to meet him. He was a tough character, he mellowed in his older years, but I think you can say he was a formidable character. And so he went away to Chennai and had a family to support. He had a family of 8, I think. So he had to make money, and he did it elsewhere. And Krishnamacharya carried on his legacy, and Pattabhi Jois carried on with these sequences that he learnt, and he with Krishnamacharya, but he just employed the sequences. Like I said, he was an innovator because he just employed these sequences with adult bodies. But we remember when David Williams came, first of all, and I quizzed him on it, when he saw what Pattabhi Jois was teaching, because he was still teaching an Indian audience from 1948 to 1973, when the first Westerners come, 1948 to 73, he was still teaching from his home and then a little bit in the college. But, maybe you haven't been, but if you've seen the way that the Indian is taught generally, it's a lot more relaxed, let's say. It used to be in Gokulam that we would go in the afternoons to have a chat with Sharat or even see Pattabhi Jois. We had the provisional tea with Pattabhi Jois at one point. Sharat invited us to have tea with the grandfather. It was a bit of a letdown because Pattabhi Jois was just kind of walking around. He was a bit old at that point. But when you used to go in, you used to see them teaching the Indian body, and they just teach in a much more relaxed manner, let's say. They weren't pushing, they weren't push. And David Williams said, when I asked him about how Pattabhi Jois was teaching the sequences then, he said, they were just relaxed. People used to go for an hour before work and then just go to work. It was just a relaxed thing. And it was only he started pushing people when the Westerners came. And really you could say that it was a perfect storm in a way, because the Westerns pushed themselves and Pattabhi Jois just helped them. If they hadn't done that, he wouldn't have done that either. It was very much more like that. As I told you, maybe I was speaking on a podcast that Mark Darby used to have this crazy vinyasa that used to jump he used to press up to a handstand from a forward fold and go over to a back bend and go back over to a handstand and back over to the next posture of primary series. So if you can imagine, it's linked by a tick-tock into a handstand, and Pattabhi Jois used to let him do it. And then one day he was too tired or injured with his shoulder to do it anymore, and Pattabhi Jois just said, good. But he never told him not to do it, So a lot was allowed. It was like, well, you're going to have to find this out yourself, It's like you can do that and see what happens, So there was a lot more of that kind of mentality, And so when David Williams goes over, he says that David Williams told me that no one had actually completed the Pattabhi Jois's curriculum. It was on the wall of the Shala. He had his sequences, the primary, the second, the advanced A and the B, but no one had completed the sequence for 15 years. So Pattabhi Jois is also quite happy because suddenly he's got people that are a bit more, they're older, like his audience was older, but they're Western bodies that are much more focused on asana, the Indian. If you even go over today, it's more catching on now, but even when we were over in the early 2000s, generally the Indians not so focused on body beautiful and body consciousness, which I think is probably a more balanced way to be honest. But it's the Western body that, the athletic types, the American young athletic types, they make it dynamic, they make it more athletic, and Pattabhi Jois is kind of happy because I always imagine it's like an older person. He's just retiring. It's a kind of perfect timing, really, because Pattabhi Jois is on the cusp of retirement in 73. Then he suddenly finds these young Westerners coming over, and it's like an older person who's on retire, and he suddenly kind of has memories of his youth, and how they were all doing it in the Mysore Palace together, and and there's these young Western people that want to do it really dynamically. So he's kind of encouraged by this, and he makes them practice twice a day. He has them come in the morning, and they do 2 series in the morning and 2 series in the evening. So that's the requirement. You sign the letter, and you first of all come, in the early 70s, the one requirement is you have to do it 6 days a week, and you have to do it twice a day. Yeah, otherwise, if you miss one day, you can't come again. Yeah. So that's the main requirement. You have to have a good reason, right? You're sick, you can't get out of bed. Yeah, yeah. And I asked David Williams or David Swenson, who was there in the early days, he said, "Why did he make you do twice a day?" He says, "Oh, I just think it was just an experiment, really. He just wanted to see how much." He wanted to see how much we could do, and it was, and the name of the as on her T-shirt, Carmen's T-shirt, Ashtanga Yoga Research Center. But Tabi Joyce was kind of developing things and testing things out as he went along, And there's many examples of that, loads, too many to really mention here. One was Parivrita Parsvakonasana, when the arm goes outside and you're doing the long twist, and he took that out because he said no one can do this one. Yeah, and that was in Hawaii, and then people protested and said, "Well, we really like that one," and he said, "Okay, you can have it back in again." So there's lots of changes like that. It was, I suppose to say that it wasn't such a rigid thing, that it's always been this way, yeah. And as I said, David, there's an interesting thing, those 7 headstands that come at the end of second series, those were on David Williams' request. It's down to him that they're there, because he said, "Oh, can I do any more?" And Patabi Joyce for some reason said, "Well, yeah, you can have these headstands and do them at the end of second series." And then they kept them in, and they developed like that. So many little things that have developed like that from over the years, from the start, right? It was never just that like one way, right? And as I said, things were compressed due to time. So when Darby first came, or when the early teachers first came, it was 10 breaths. You stayed in the postures 10 breaths. Then later, when more people came, remember I told you it was 8 people in the small room in Lakshmipuram? And then it was moved, that was in the back room, I believe. And then they extended the house, and they had that front room. You might have seen the old Shah in Lakshmipuram, that small red front room, right? And then they managed to cram 13 people in there in the end. There was one person who had a weird strip in the middle. Yeah? So it came from 8 to 12 to 13, but it still meant up until the 2000s that there was a queue up the stairs until lunchtime, from 5 in the morning till 1 in the afternoon, because there was no space for people. So what they did is they just shortened people's practices, and that's why the A and B series, it was only advanced A and B, got cut down into these 4 series, because before that you would do the whole of advanced A, which was 2 series really. And then if people were working on the whole series, that would take them up to 4 hours. Right? They would be there so obviously you can't have people 4 hours there when you've got 100 people waiting on the stairs to join. So they shorten things. Now it's no longer 10 breaths, it's 8 breaths. No longer 8 breaths, 5 breaths, right? No, some people I was talking to another early student, is Graham Northfield. He's a student who comes in the early 80s from Australia. He's still around teaching in Australia. I'm trying to get him on the podcast still. He's a little bit shy, it seems. And if you're watching, Graham, and he was given a practice that lasted him 4 hours. He told me it would be there 4 hours. Another student, Dina Kingsburg, 4 hours, right? Because they're doing a whole series. And then to the next series. So it just makes sense to shorten things, to make things shorter, and that's why you just get this just primary series. Whereas originally, there would be. They didn't even know that there was 2 series between primary and second or intermediate. They thought it was 1 series. Okay? So there's small changes like that. And this idea of the counted method, as I said, it never happens in Mysore because they're not doing leg classes. It only comes in later when you have to know the exact Mysore count, right? Which is only there really, when if you've been to Mysore, then you have classic points when you better not move, like musical statues. Like I always think after Upvishta Kanatna, up to Supta Kanasana, you come up, you go down, don't move there, you'll be in trouble, right? If you know, right? It's only there, it's not to know the count, it's only there to try and get people to understand the incremental nature. Like you inhale and you exhale, wait, then you do your next posture. And I think a big revelation to me, going to Mysore after learning from Western teachers in the UK and abroad, was that I kind of felt like it was one long flowing sequence, almost like I did martial arts like a kata, like you do a pattern in a martial arts as well, or a dance flow. But when I went to Mysore and I heard Batawi Joyce counting, it was very staccato. It was like you do Janu Shirshasana, now, now ashto inhale, exhale. It was very stoppy-starty. And from what I understood, the vinyasa wasn't to make a flow, it was actually to break a flow, which is interesting, right? So it's not to link the movements, rather it's to divide the movements, right? And I think we often tend to make it all bring but one flow, rather than, there's different asanas, right? Because pre-20th century, pre-Krishnamacharya, you don't have any dynamic asana practices, right? There's three people innovating really. Krishnamacharya at the start of the 20th century, Sri Yogendra, he's a teacher from Mumbai, I always forget his actual name, yeah, and Kavalyananda in the Kavalyadam ashram, you might know that, in Lonavala, yeah, Sri Swami Kavalyananda. And all of them start developing a dynamic movement-based practice, but prior to 20th century, it's just static asanas, it doesn't exist. Yep. So Krishnamacharya is already innovating at that time to make a flowing practice. Yep. And if you read different books, you can get your hands on Norman Soiman's book, The Traditions of the Mysore Palace, and that gives you more background on where the postures might have come from, because if you look at tantric texts pre-20th century, you don't see all those postures. Yeah. So where did they come from? Yeah. How do they start going into a flow? Because the tantric texts only have static asanas. Yeah. And I've got the podcast with Norman Soiman as well. And then there's ideas of where these came from, and we can, discuss that another time probably. That you've got the two texts, the Sri Tattva Nidhi, and that's in the Mysore Palace Library, and there's another text, the Hatha Bhyasa Padati, which is the two texts are related, and they seem to suggest that there might be a flow between the static asanas. Although they don't teach a flow, they seem to suggest that there's some kind of movement between the asanas. But it's between these two texts that people say, well, and they're around the 1800s. They're not too old, So, I think late 1700s, 1850s, yeah, up to that. They seem to suggest that the postures might be linked. But before that, there's certainly no evidence of a moving sequence of asanas. Yeah? So Krishnamacharya is certainly innovating, and he's using the term vinyasa, yeah? Vinyasa yoga. Yeah? But there is, as much as Pattabhi Jois used to say, he used to quote that, you might have heard this, "Oh yogi, don't do yoga without vinyasa." Yeah? There's no, from Vamana Rishi, there's no evidence of vinyasa being used as a way of connecting breath and movement pre-1900s. Yeah. Before that, vinyasa is there as a Sanskrit word, but the usage is different. It's to do with getting the ritual right, getting the mudra and the mantra right. It's not to do with linking movements and yoga. Yeah. So Krishnamacharya innovated. He probably used texts in the Mysore Palace Library that we don't have current access to, because currently Westerners have been denied access to Indian literature and culture for reasonable reasons, really. The last person to see those texts was the Norman Soiman, and he recorded in his book, The Traditions of the Mysore Palace, which you can order off Amazon, or you can listen to the podcast as well. And then he has ideas of where Krishnamacharya learnt his yoga as well, perhaps not the Himalayas, but perhaps closer in Karnataka. But yeah, we can say that Krishnamacharya definitely developed a method, and he developed it in the Mysore Palace, and he borrowed from older texts, but he was also innovating. He was also using what he knew and developing from, possibly from other traditions as well. You might have heard of Mark Singleton's yoga body, and there's ideas of Western movement maybe borrowed in there. Other people also suggest that some of the movements resemble there was a very popular trend of Chinese circus coming to Mysore at the time. So it's likely people say that Krishnamacharya might have looked at those movements, and but the point is that he was using movements, not to say, it doesn't, because the movements aren't exactly and haven't existed for 5,000 years, they're not yoga. The point is that they're yoga because they're used within a certain technique, which is the is Hatha yoga technique. Yeah. And that rests as a similar thing. When I recently had a conversation with Richard Freeman about this, personally in Thailand last month, he said to me, Krishnamacharya and Pattabhi Jois were really very interested with the central channel. They were really very interested in the tantric method still, means to draw the energy inwards and have this kind of compressive aspect of drawing prana into the body. So it's not to do, when we talk about ashtanga yoga or yoga is just a seat for meditation, as I often see, we're doing this to concentrate the mind and prepare it for Raj Yoga meditation. Well, not exactly. If you look at Krishnamacharya's way of teaching, and you look at some of the cryptic things that Pattabhi Jois said in the early years, you can even see him on YouTube, if you can unpick his language. He's talking about yoga, blood boiling, and this kind of tantric method of compressing energy. I mean, he's trying to say that in his own way, right? So it's not to say that this method of asana is just there in the Patanjali way. You do asana, then you do pranayama, then you prepare the mind. No, if you're doing a bodily practice, it's for the sake of energy in the body in itself. Yeah. So. I could probably go on, but now, I want to leave a little bit of space, and maybe I've said something that might have piqued your interest, or you've got your own questions. Speak now or forever hold your peace. Or you have to hear me go on longer. But I thought it was getting comforting, that I said, with asking Richard that, who was there with Pattabhi Jois on his own for many years, and had direct conversations with Pattabhi Jois, that they definitely had this interest in yoga as a hatha yoga. Ha means force. Often it's translated as sun moon, which is also esoteric, and you're balancing the two. You're balancing the principle of the throat, and the principle of the solar principle of the belly. There's two models of tantric. One is raising, and one is joining. In tantric yoga, one is raising kundalini from below to up, and one is joining. One is trying to join the two forces, the prana with the apana in the middle. Yeah, there's two models there. So but the ha, generally, etymologically, if you look to people like James Mallinson, I've got the podcast with him you can listen to as well, it means force. Ha, it comes from the root force. You're doing something forceful with the body. Yeah, it's not just concentration. It's an energy practice. I think if we're doing something involving so many asanas, it only makes sense that it's something that's not just trying to find one asana for meditation. Otherwise, you just need a few. Yeah. It's a more embodied practice, trying to use the energy of the body. So I think if you look at it in that capacity, then it sets you in good stead for what you're doing in this practice. Yeah.
I want to ask something about an asana.
Good. It's going to be a quiet time otherwise, but yeah.
Paschimottanasana. I read one time ago in ancient, I think it was an ancient text. It was called, they called it the asana of immortality. Can you explain, can you elaborate a little bit what happens energetically in the body?
Yeah.
Paschimottanasana, please.
Yeah. I think if you look, try by all means to read texts like the Pradipika or the Gunda Samhita, or read these texts, and you quite quickly. I started. I'll still do a few more. I think you're going to blog post on the tantric text, but after the third one, I was like, okay, another one of now you raise the energy up and you pierce this channel, and then you're having this experience, and then you hear these sounds. It's like I'm not, I've never heard these sounds. I've never had that experience. So after a while, it's like, I'm going to keep my mind open, but I think we're going to also have to pragmatize these tantric texts and take them pragmatically to what our experiences actually might be. Otherwise, we're hearing and reading something out here and doing something down here, and the two never meet, and the one doesn't then guide the other. So if we're going to let tantric texts guide us, we have to look at it pragmatically with a pragmatic mind and say, well, how do we translate this symbolic language, which is very much up here, to pragmatically our experiences, which are very much more down here. Yeah? Which is to say that, yes, there's these ideas of immortality. What you're doing is that's the fundamental asana of back stretching, right? It's paschima uttanasana. Ut is intense, paschima is westward. You're stretching the back to the west. You're practicing yoga to the east. So you're really engaging your scapula and your back muscles, and it's probably the fundamental way that you can understand that, right? The second reason, which is slightly more tantric, which is offered by, I think in Richard Rosen's book, if you haven't read that, that's a great book. It's called Yoga FAQ. I've done a podcast with that guy recently. Really good book, really good actually. And it's literally the frequently asked questions of students. And one of them is on Paschimottanasana. And the second thing that I've never heard till recently that he mentions in Paschimottanasana is that it's a use of compressive. It's because you're compressing the body, like I've mentioned, of pushing together, pushing back. Yeah. And the other way of Paschima, the other reading of that, because Sanskrit words can have lots of different meanings, is to do with the central channel. It's a euphemism, a hidden euphemism for central channel. So it's compressing the energy into the central channel. So, yeah. So that's the idea of drawing in, pushing back, and trying to put the prana into the central channel again. And so that's another way to describe that. So that I guess prana in the central channel, Paschimottanasana being called that, yoga of immortality kind of makes sense. Yeah. Again, nothing to do with stretching your hamstrings. That doesn't give you immortality. Pulling forward into a forward, because the forward fold does suggest. I mean, to be honest, the forward does suggest how far can you get the chest forward onto the legs. Yeah. But that negates the idea of you. And if you don't translate the tantric text and they don't offer any sorts of guidance, then you're not getting any benefit if you just take them too literally. But if you start to read them with an open mind and try and translate them more pragmatically to what we're doing now, yeah, as I said, you're kind of doing a Tantra light, yeah? Which you're immediately doing, because if you also read the tantric text, or if you read any yoga text, the first thing that comes to mind is they're not practicing for this life, you know? They're practicing for outside this life, they're practicing for rebirth, better rebirth, you know. Patanjali and Bhagavad Gita is all about trying to practice for a better rebirth. Or if you look at the more recent Hatha yoga texts, so the tantric text, they're looking for emancipation in this life and then for not coming back again, for abiding in a higher realm. Yeah. So, I mean, we have to realize as long as we're looking for some benefit in this life, we're immediately doing something different. It's not to say we're not doing yoga, but we're doing something different to pre-20th century yoga. It's only in the 20th century that we can entrust Krishnamacharya for bringing the yoga to the householder and being interested to explain yoga in a more pragmatic way to householders for their worldly aims in this world and not the next. Yeah. Prior to that, we don't really have that. Yeah. Same with Hinduism. If we look at the Arya Samaj, the Brahmana Samaj, of which Vivekananda, you might have heard of that guy, is part of. Yeah. When he comes over in the Parliament, 1896, right, and brings yoga to the West for the first time, right? He's part of the Neo-Hindu group, and the Neo-Hindus, in the vein of the Brahmo Samaj, the Arya Samaj, around Calcutta, they are modernizing Hinduism and making it for this life. Prior to that, Hinduism has always been about how to avoid rebirth or get higher rebirth. Yeah. So as long as we're doing yoga for this life, we're doing yoga in a different way. We're doing yoga, for different ends than prior 20th century. Doesn't make it wrong, because that's our current aims. We have to practice with current aims in mind. We can't fool ourselves. If you're practicing and saying, well, I'm really practicing for a higher incarnation, well, maybe you're not being completely honest with yourself. Yeah. Yeah.
I was thinking the same question, because you already explained, but maybe I want to emphasize, because in Giranda Sanhila Hatha Yoga Dipika, they do a lot of promises, paranormal. For example, if you do Sarvangasana, you will get a lot of paranormal. They are not. So I'm doing yoga for years, and I don't levitate, I don't, etc.
Next year it comes.
So maybe
for anyone watching that on repeat on YouTube, if we're watching now, we should have turned the camera to that whole to him saying that question, because it was it was funny. Yeah, it's true. It's totally true. I mean, if you do this posture, it'll give you this. If you do this posture, it'll give you this. Yeah. And then the latter day version of it, when you hear B.K.C. Iyengar saying the light of yoga, and even yoga, it says, if you do this, it'll you'll never have piles again. If you do, often it's about complaints of the urinary tract, right? If you do this posture, it will cure you of often the bad fat of the waist, that Iyengar, or it will take the bad fat of the waist. It's like doing Navasana, will cure you of the bad fat of the waist. It's like, probably not, So that tradition of claims has carried on continuously from there, it's not been my experience, and having taught, having spoken to people that are, of advanced level of asana, I don't think it's been their experience either. So we can only suggest that either they had a higher experience in reality back in the 1700s in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, or they were using symbolic language, or it's a different cultural context. Yeah. You see, what we're doing, which is why Indians get really annoyed at this, is we're taking a Western perspective and we're analysing from an outsider culture into a culture. Yep. Whereas when you're analysing within a culture, you're not using outside influences, you're treating culture in a different way. Yeah. Because we're looking from an outside context in, not within that culture. Yep. So you can never really say, because our perspective is different, how that they're treating that language. Yep. How they're using that language, because we're looking from our perspective to that language. Yeah.
But someone use this to promise even to other people in our culture, in West.
Yes.
You are doing
yes.
This, you will get
yes. Yeah. I know there's a famous example as well in Romania, isn't there, of a teacher doing this, and like all my years and speaking to all the people, no one's ever got, and there was another question, another group, has anyone ever got enlightened through this method? I've not spoken to anyone that has used this method and from this method become enlightened, so all I can say is let's have pragmatic aims and practice honestly for our goals, and use that, and read. If you read them, it's interesting, and you can glean good information out of these tantric texts. But I think we have to take it lightly when they're making these promises of, as you say, like inverting the body. You will get immortality from inverting the body. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. But on the other hand, look at the modern text. Look at Kevalyananda. He's doing experiments in Kevalyananda Ashram, Kevalidam. Yeah. From the early 20th century, and he's particularly interested in shoulder stand. And he's particularly interested in shoulder stand because he believes that shoulder stand regulates the thyroid, and then through the thyroid, you're regulating a lot of the the hormonal secretions of the body. So he's doing a lot of tests on shoulder, trying to prove that shoulder stand is very, very important to help with the whole of the hormonal regulation of the body. He never proves it conclusively, actually. But he's, maybe there's something to do with the stimulation of the thyroid gland. Yeah.
Well, I can say that one of my students told me that she was on this pill for the thyroid. I don't know, Enquiries. And after she began yoga for a while, she stopped using the pill, and the numbers were normal values. So it
could be something's there with the inversion. Yeah,
it worked. She says, I'm continuing with yoga because of that.
There are a lot of benefits.
No, don't get me wrong, there's not benefits, but I think it's like, if you look up here for the benefits, then you often, you lose what's here,
Yeah, sure.
And I think I think that could be often the danger, because if you're thinking something magical is going to happen, then you actually lose sight of the subtle details, which are big changes for your life, because you're hoping for something mystical to happen. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
In the idea of people practicing with the same aim, do you think that people practicing with the same aim, they have a certain, let's say power or certain different kind of intensity than the person that practices in a different aim than the others?
Yeah, that's a question I always go circle around again and again, because I think that doesn't matter what your aims are. I think it's just to be honest with what your aims actually are. But in the end, you see, the human being will never accept meaning other than the meaning of self. So in the end, that meaning of, look, you can practice for a great body, for a great accomplishment in asana, but in the end, that meaning won't satisfy you. Yeah, so you have to go deeper to a deeper level of meaning and a deeper level of meaning until you come back to the only thing that's actually the meaning of self as it is, yeah, of consciousness shared as one, yeah. You come back to that point of oneness in the end. If you keep going for your meaning, when you get wrong meaning, you'll hit it and you won't be satisfied and you'll go deeper. So from my perspective is, don't be dishonest about your meaning, because your meaning is what motivates you. Whatever your meaning is, however you phrase that in your own terms, in your own feeling, because really it's a feeling, it's not even a cognizant sense. However you frame that, go with that, because it's always mixed anyway. You practice for a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and gradually, things deepen and shift as you go on, and the cosmetic and the accomplishment becomes less, then you're practicing for a deeper, let's say your meaning goes deeper, but it goes naturally without pretending that you're practicing for devotional reasons or whatever, and you're actually practicing because you want to do third series, That's just dishonesty. What you're looking for is emotional integrity,